easy to judge a book by its cover, assuming, of course, it's not an e-book. We see the artwork, the use of line and color, and make a decision as to whether or not that book is worth our while. Sure, people say we can't do it, but if we're honest, that just makes us want to do it a little more. That being said, judging a cover is not the only method we use for deciding the worthiness of a book. Recommendations are also a huge factor. If a friend raves about a book, then we are more likely to run out and grab it. If that friend's name happens to be Oprah, then we will buy it for sure. But unfortunately, we know that even if the cover is great, and Oprah has given it the thumbs up, there is still no guarantee that we are going to like the book. The truth is, there's really only one way to know that, and that is to read it. Friends, until they figure out how to download it directly into our brains, the only option we have, if we want to know if we like a book, is to read it. And while we know that a truly informed judgment would require us to read the whole thing, we also know that human nature is such that we don't have to read much before we decide whether or not we like it. For most of us, this means that the beginning has to grab us. Sure, there are those among us who practice the unnatural art of reading the end first. But for most sane people, we start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Friends, we start at the beginning of a book because it offers us the intended first glimpse of the world in which the characters live, of the argument being made, of the main premise. Knowing those basics, we can decide whether or not to commit to the book further. Sure, sometimes the beginning can be great and the rest can let us down, like a certain minister's sermons, or the beginning can be awful and the rest turns out to be great, hopefully like this sermon. But most of the time, we know just a few paragraphs in whether it's worth our while or not. And so today, on this first Sunday after Pentecost, on this Father's Day, though the cover is plain and Oprah has not recommended it, let's pick up a familiar book together and see what we can discover in the first few paragraphs. That's right, friends. Today, like most Sundays, we are reading the Bible. But unlike most Sundays, when we jump feet first somewhere into the depths of its mysteries, today we start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. But before we start, we should probably admit that there is more than the plain cover and lack of recommendations to overcome before we pick up this book we call the Bible. The truth is, this is a book that comes with some baggage. We know that for as great as a book this is, and all the good news it contains, it has nevertheless been abused over and over again throughout Christian history. We remember how it has been used to justify bigotry and sexism, and has been the excuse for the death and destruction of many. And frankly, hearing that makes us want to lock it up somewhere in the back of our closets or in the pews in front of us. But friends, if we do that, if we as a people of faith never open it, if we don't take the time to try and figure out what it actually says, then we are dooming those who come after us to further abuses. In other words, just because we don't like some of what it says, doesn't mean we shouldn't read it. Friends, we don't have to agree with all of it, but we owe it to ourselves and to those countless imperfect people who wrote it to at least attempt to hear what they were trying to tell us about God. The truth is, friends, we read the Bible because we know that for all the imperfect parts that people have used and abused throughout our history, an underlying message of God's perfect love for us that, if lived out, could change our future. And friends, that makes it worth reading. And so today, though we acknowledge that this is a book with some significant baggage, we nevertheless pick it up together and attempt to read it as we would any other book in order to judge for ourselves whether or not it is worth reading further. And because we are mostly sane people, we start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. It opens with familiar words. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Now, because this is so well known, it's easy to overlook just how much this line reveals, both about the book and about God. First, we learn that God was a fan of baseball. After all, creation took place in the big inning. Just kidding. Seriously, though, it says something about the scope of this book. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Whomever it was that originally told this story wanted listeners and eventual readers to understand that what is about to be told encompasses all of history. Not a particular moment, but all of it. It was that way from the beginning. Frankly, it's hard to imagine a scope that could be much bigger than the creation of the universe. It points out that there never was, nor will there ever be, a time when we are not within God's creation. Friends, when the editors got together and looked at the two creation stories, this one we will hear today and the one that starts in the Garden of Eden, it must have been easy to pick which one would come first. The magnitude and scope of this one reveals something about God. It says that God has been present and continues to be present in the world. The literal translation of this opening line is actually more like, in the beginning of God's creating. As in, this was just the start of what was to come. In the beginning of God's creating. In other words, friends, the very first line of our Bible offers a message that would be repeated throughout the rest. A message of inclusive and radical hope. Hope that we are all a part of God's creation. And hope that this is just the beginning. The first sentence continues. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Wind from God swept over the face of the waters. It's a beautifully poetic passage that reveals some of the ancient notions about the way in which the universe was structured. It pictures the earth as present before God's creating, but that it didn't take on form until a wind from God swept over the waters. In other words, the world doesn't make sense without God. Now, one question that might naturally pop up when reading this first sentence is, what's up with the waters? Where did the waters come from? Why were they there? And when we do a little research, we might learn that ancient peoples understood the earth as both the center of the universe and flat, and that the sky was a dome that kept out the waters above. Now, we could choose to stop reading here and have a hearty laugh at the silly ancient people for not knowing the earth circles around the sun, it's a part of a solar system, which itself is in a galaxy in the middle of swaths of vast non-matter space. But to do so just might be to miss the point. You see, our brothers and sisters in faith often get hung up trying to make this a scientific account of how the world came into being. same questions as us. How did we get here? And what are we supposed to do? And when they asked those questions, they didn't jump to sophisticated scientific explanations. No, they told stories that shared what answers they had discovered thus far. They told stories that revealed what they had learned about God, so that people coming after them could understand. Friends, they were trying to communicate to us something about our relationship to God, not about the way in which the evolutionary process worked. There's a difference. The truth is, this is a poetic account that reveals to us truth about God, but it's not attempting to offer fact about the origin of species. There's a difference that often gets missed and, frankly, becomes another reason why people put this book down so quickly, or worse, never open it at all. In other words, as Christians, we could stop here and contact our legislators to take theories like evolution out of our children's textbooks, or we could recognize that evolution is scientifically how we got here, but it doesn't tell us who or whose we are. For that, we would do well to listen to our ancient ancestors. When we look at the story itself, we see fundamentally the connection of God to light and darkness, to the sky above us and the water around us. We see God in the creatures of the sea and the birds of the air. But most important of all, we see God's relationship to us. Friends, over and over again, week after week, we remind one another that we are children of God. All of us, young and old, black and white, gay and straight, male and female, we are all children of God. Here, in the very first chapter of what turns out to be a very long book, we are reminded of the same thing. As the story is told, every day a similar pattern is followed. God creates, God calls it good, and another day passes. It moves like that through the separation of light from darkness, of the sky from the waters, the sun and the moon, then on to the creation of vegetation and living creatures, until finally on the sixth day, God creates us. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Friends, God, who speaks in the first person plural, seeming to imply something about the nature of God as related to the community, says that we are created in God's image, in God's likeness. Friends, we are created in God's image. We're created in God's image. And we're pretty sure that's a good thing. After all, God calls it good. But we have to admit that we don't quite know what it means. At least not at first. Our initial impulse is to picture some androgynous person that if we saw walking down the street, we would all point to and say, "Hey, that kind of looks like me." But to do so kind of ignores the image that has been painted of God thus far in the story. The fact is, the image we have of God thus far is as Creator. And if that's the case, then perhaps this story is there to remind us that we are fundamentally made to be a creative people. A people who are called to create a world that is better than we left it. We will certainly hear that theme repeated in the pages ahead. The story goes on to say that we are given dominion over all things of this world. Now, while some have taken dominion to mean power over, the better translation is perhaps that we are called to be stewards of all living things. In other words, friends, we are called to be a people who care for one another. Maybe that is part of what it means to be created in the image of God. that we too have a responsibility to recognize ourselves as fundamentally a part of the community. Maybe we should be using the first person plural. Friends, from the very beginning of the Scriptures, we are reminded not only that we are all children of God, that we are created in the image of God, but that because of that, we have a responsibility to one another. And it's an equal responsibility. It doesn't fall to the man or to the woman, or vice versa. After all, it says God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. God created them. In other words, there's equality from the very beginning. There's a recognition that men and women were both created in the image of God to be a people of creativity. Once humankind was created in the story, God gave the command to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, the first thing we are told to do in the Bible is to create. And in some ways, that's the command we continue to live out in different ways today. Certainly on this Father's Day, it makes sense to recognize that some of us will create life through having children, an act that itself takes a community in more ways than one. But friends, having children is just one of the ways we create life. It's just one of the ways that we are fruitful and multiply. The truth is, we create life when we work for justice. We create life when we take care of our environment. We create life each time we reach out in love to one another. And the life we create is not just for the other person, but for ourselves as well. Because as we learn in the chapters ahead, it is only through living a life of love that we ever truly live. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Our passage ends with God taking a break. God is said to have taken the seventh day to chill. Perhaps there's a reminder here for us that we can't see either the effects of our creativity or what needs to happen next unless we pause long enough to get a good look. Friends, creativity needs and deserves rest. And so do we. And with that, we've reached the end of the first story in a very long book. After this, some of us will want to continue reading, and some of us will not. The choice is ours. But friends, if we are going into the world to create with any integrity, then we owe it to ourselves to at least read the advice of those who came before us. And who knows, once we've read the whole thing, maybe we can work on the cover and get Oprah to add it to her list. But the good news, the great news, is that this is just the beginning.